I've faced some of the most dangerous situations imaginable. I've worked in places where the law barely exists, where survival depends on quick decisions and steady nerves. I've dealt with criminals, warlords, and people who betray you without hesitation. But strangely enough, none of that prepared me for the fight I'd face when I returned home. The battle wasn't overseas this time. It wasn't against an enemy army or a criminal network. It was for the one person I had always promised to protect. My mother. My mom, Clara, is 93 years old. And despite her age, she's still one of the toughest people I know. She raised me by herself while my father served overseas. She worked 2 jobs for years, doing whatever it took to keep food on the table and a roof over our heads. She never complained, never asked for sympathy, and never gave up. The house she lives in now is the same one she's called home for more than 50 years. To anyone else, it might just look like a small suburban home, but to her, it's everything. It's where she planted the oak tree in the front yard the day I was born. It's where she stood on the porch every time I returned from deployment. It's her safe place, her sanctuary. I was home on a short leave, enjoying a rare break from work, when my phone rang. It was my mom. The moment I heard her voice, I knew something was wrong. She sounded shaken, something I hadn't heard since the day my father passed away. She told me she had received a letter in the mail, an eviction notice. It came from her Homeowners Association. They were giving her 7 days. 7 days to pack up 50 years of memories and leave the home she had built her life around. The moment she said those words, my blood went cold. I told her not to worry and that I was on my way immediately. The drive to her house took about 2 hours, but it felt much longer. My mind kept racing the entire way. My mother had always been the perfect neighbor. Her garden had won community awards more than once. She paid every HOA fee on time. She followed every rule. None of this made any sense. When I arrived, I found her sitting quietly at the kitchen table, staring down at the letter. The document was filled with complicated legal language and a long list of supposed violations she had committed over the past year. When I started reading them, I could hardly believe it. One citation claimed her rose bushes were slightly overgrown. Another complained about a garden gnome that supposedly didn't match the neighborhood's aesthetic guidelines. There was even a violation for a tiny crack in her driveway. It was ridiculous. Every single accusation was petty and meaningless. I reached across the table and took her hand. It felt smaller and more fragile than I remembered. When I looked into her eyes, I saw fear and confusion. And in that moment, something inside me changed. A switch flipped. This wasn't a battlefield in some distant country. This was my home. And someone had just declared war on my mother. I squeezed her hand and told her calmly, "Mom, you don't need to worry about any of this. I'm going to take care of it." The fear in her expression softened slightly, replaced by a small spark of hope. That was all the motivation I needed. The first step was reconnaissance, something my training had taught me to do before making any move. Over the next 2 days, I focused on gathering information. I started by looking into the HOA board itself. The president of the association was a man named Mr. Henderson. He was a retired property developer who had a reputation for being aggressive and controlling. The other board members mostly seemed to follow whatever he said without question. Next, I started talking to the neighbors. These were people who had known my mother for years. I didn't approach them like an investigator. Instead, I simply introduced myself as Clara's son and asked a few casual questions. When people don't feel pressured, they tend to open up, and open up they did. Story after story started coming out about Henderson. Apparently, he had been trying to acquire several homes along my mother's street. The reason soon became clear. A company connected to him, conveniently registered under his son-in-law's name, had recently purchased land just outside the neighborhood. Their plan was to build a large commercial complex. But there was a problem. The easiest road access to that future development would cut directly through my mother's property and several of her neighbors' homes. Suddenly, everything made sense. Henderson had been using the HOA as his personal weapon. He targeted elderly residents with minor violations and inflated fines, hoping to pressure them into selling their homes cheaply. My mother's house happened to sit in the most important location for his project. It was the final piece he needed. Unfortunately for him, he had made a serious mistake. He saw a 93-year-old woman living alone. What he didn't see was her son, a man whose job involved dismantling complicated operations far more dangerous than a homeowners association. Compared to that, Henderson's scheme looked simple. Once I had gathered enough information, it was time to plan my move. The HOA had scheduled an emergency meeting 5 days later, where they planned to finalize my mother's eviction. That meant I had less than 3 days to turn the situation around. I called an old friend of mine from my service days. These days he worked as a forensic accountant. If there was hidden money somewhere, he could find it. I sent him everything I had collected about Henderson, his son-in-law's company, and their recent property purchases. While he started digging into the financial side, I focused on the community. I helped my mother write a letter, not an angry one, and not a legal threat. Instead, it was simply her story. She wrote about her life in that house, the decades she had spent caring for the neighborhood, and how hurt and confused she felt by the eviction notice. We printed copies and went door to door delivering them personally. My mom stood beside me as we spoke to each neighbor. It wasn't about accusations. It was about honesty. The reaction was immediate. People were angry. Many of them had experienced Henderson's bullying before, but they had been afraid to stand up alone. Now they realized they weren't the only ones being targeted. The night before the HOA meeting, my phone rang. It was my accountant friend. He sounded excited. "Got it," he said. "You're not going to believe this." He had discovered that Henderson had been using HOA funds, money collected from residents, to pay for surveys, legal work, and planning related to his personal development project. The payments had been hidden through several shell companies. In other words, it was fraud, and not the small kind. The next evening, my mother and I walked into the community meeting hall together. The room was packed with residents. Henderson sat at the front of the table, looking confident and completely unaware of what was about to happen. He opened the meeting and immediately began discussing my mother's supposed violations. That's when I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I simply walked to the front of the room and spoke calmly. "Mr. Henderson," I said, "we're not here to discuss my mother's garden gnome." Then I placed a thick stack of documents on the table in front of him. "We're here to talk about your development project." The entire room went silent. I began explaining the financial records, the shell companies, and the trail of money connecting HOA funds to Henderson's personal business ventures. I laid out bank statements, property records, and sworn statements from 2 former employees of his son-in-law's company. Within minutes, the room erupted with outrage. Residents were shouting questions. Board members looked stunned as they realized they had been manipulated. Henderson tried banging his gavel to regain control of the meeting, but no one was listening anymore. His authority had disappeared. I looked him directly in the eyes and said calmly, "You gave my mother 7 days to leave her home. I'm giving you 24 hours to resign from this board and deliver a written apology to her." Then I tapped the stack of evidence. After that, this goes to the district attorney and the IRS. The next morning, a resignation letter appeared on my mother's doorstep, along with a very uncomfortable written apology. The eviction notice was immediately canceled, and the remaining board members launched an investigation. Henderson and his son-in-law are now facing serious criminal charges. A few days later, I sat with my mom on her front porch as the sun set over her garden. She looked peaceful again. She turned to me and said softly, "I was scared, but I knew you'd take care of it." I smiled. I've fought in some difficult places around the world, but there's no mission more important than protecting your family. And Henderson learned one important lesson the hard way. He picked a fight with the wrong soldier's mother.